Welcome back from the break, and we'll start with our next panel on big data and climate adaptation technologies. And hopefully, we'll have discussions which were touched upon by the previous panels on data to knowledge to decision making, and more importantly, informed decision making, how we can start to pull data together from a variety of sources, and that impacts decision making from various sectors' perspective. And from an ND-GAIN is the world's leading index today, showing which countries are best prepared to deal with global changes brought about by overcrowding, resource constraints, and climate disruption. And it does that by looking at data going back over 15 years, and ranks countries, or 170 countries, based on different dimensions and how vulnerable they are to droughts, superstorms, and other natural disasters, and uniquely how ready they are to successfully implement adaptation solutions. So if you think about it from that perspective, going back 15 years of data, identifying factors of vulnerability, and then figuring out how ready they are for investment decisions, we are charting the path from data to knowledge to decision making. It sort of is the pipeline. So one thing I'd like to begin the panel with quoting a famous economist, and let me get my notes out.
You can make it up.
I'm going to make it up, and I've known Rayid for several years, so he knows how I play it. So in the economist Hayek, who shared the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences for pioneering work in the theory of money and economic fluctuations, and penetrating analysis of the independence of economic, social, and institutional phenomena. Now, he frames his essay, and I quote from his essay, in the economic process and the economic planning, but remove the word economics wherever I use that, and think of it from your favorite sector. Think of it how ND-GAIN can be helpful, whether it's in infrastructure or agriculture or food or security, and it sort of adheres to what he's trying to say. So I begin. In ordinary language, we describe by the word planning the complex of interrelated decisions about the allocation of our available resources. All economic activities in this sense planning, and in any society in which many people collaborate, this planning, whoever does it, will in some measure have to be based on knowledge, which in the first instance is not given to the planner, but to somebody else. That's very important. All the knowledge, all the data that even we think about it from an ND-GAIN perspective is sitting in different silos, is different in different sectors, governed by different organizations, but yet all that information is pulled together and given to a planner who acts on that. The various ways in which the knowledge on which people base their plans is communicated to them is a crucial problem for any theory explaining the economic process. And the problem of what is the best way of utilizing knowledge, initially dispersed among all the people, is at least one of the main problems of economic policy, or of designing an efficient economic system. And it's a very powerful statement from that perspective, that how do we really leverage all the collective knowledge together to build an efficient system? And whatever responsive efficient system is going to go after. So we have a esteemed set of panelists who have some questions, and hopefully they can respond to this as well. We'll start with Amy Luers, who is the Climate Change Director, Skoll Global Threats Fund. And her work has focused on water and climate work, relying on data governance and public engagement in relation to global threats, enhancing access to information on water and climate resource globally, innovation in big data, and resilience in a previous work with Google. So Amy, please.
Thank you. And thank you to Joyce, if she's here, for the invitation to participate in this panel. So I wanted to start off in my opening few words to say a few words about the historical challenges of using indices in decision making, indices in general, but also indices in particular around climate change, vulnerability, and adaptive capacity, indicators like the GAIN index, which is a very strong indicator but has its limitations, as so many do. And then I want to turn to the opportunities and risks that the era of big data presents for overcoming some of these challenges. So again, let me start off in saying that I'm generally very wary of generic indices, and indices which attempt to characterize complex system in one number, or in a couple of numbers. And we're often, I'm sure we're all familiar with the phrase that a picture is worth 1,000 words, but I would say a word of caution: a number is not worth 1,000 words. And how indicators are interpreted, however, often suggests that they are. So, and if they're used in the wrong way, they can lead to bad decisions and often lead to more harm than good. So the classic example of a single indicator representing a complex system is GDP. So GDP is our single metric in the society of progress. And of course, this then creates incentives and prioritizes market-based products, goods, versus non-market-based goods, such as clean air, water, climate, for example. Now, GDP is a very important metric, but once it's placed into a decision-making process, it creates incentives and priorities that are not necessarily supportive of the general progress and values of the society. Another example, which is much more central to my world in terms of global climate change, is global average surface temperature. So global average surface temperature is the indicator that climate scientists and now the global society use as a measure of how we're doing in terms of the global climate crisis, moving closer to levels of danger and the level at which we are affecting the global climate. Now, global average climate change, global average temperature, however, doesn't really mean anything. It's not really a number. No one ever feels the global average temperature. But it's a really useful number, right? It's a useful number because it's the one characteristic about the climate that we have a lot of data about. So we can measure it as accurately as possible. So it is useful. But when you get it into a decision-making ecosystem and it is focused on as the sole metric, then it creates, it can be distracting to and blind us really to the true problem that we're trying to address. So there are obviously lots of challenges, but that doesn't mean there's not a role for them. Moving to the GAIN index, for example, we have measures of at a national level, and this can be very valuable for awareness building. But decision-making processes, it can be misleading. So take, for example, the readiness value and the vulnerability values. If you look at across the nation, the world, the US, of course, becomes very, very green. And that's appropriate if you're looking at the awareness value to look at the globe. On the other hand, it completely blinds you to the fact that a place like New Orleans is incredibly vulnerable. Now, this isn't a surprise, but when it becomes operational versus to support decision-making versus just awareness building, it really, certain people in these countries are not apparent. So part of the reason, how do we get to this place? Part of the challenge is that characterizing complex systems is complicated. So it's hard to do. We like numbers, so we land on them. But part of the problem also is oftentimes we've been limited by data. And so now in walks the era of big data. And how can, many questions arise in terms of, does big data really provide an opportunity to overcome some of these challenges? And I would say yes, it does. It provides the opportunity to shift from the single index characterization of a nation, of a sector, to looking more uniquely at a region. Instead of characterizing an indicator and placing it on a country or on a sector, looking at the sector and saying, what is it about that sector that makes it vulnerable? Vulnerable of what to what? So you can imagine sort of taking the analytical approaches of Google or a Facebook that have used their analytical approaches to look at individualizing, personalizing the advertisements that they that we see every day on the internet, and using those same analytical approaches to transforming how we do vulnerability and adaptive capacity indicators. Now, however, as I say this, I also want to be sure that we need to be careful to balance the desire to measure as the goal, measure and monitor vulnerability and resilience, or adaptive capacity, to building adaptive capacity or reducing resilience. So in this context, I'm reminded of the observer effect, the principle that we all learn in physics, that when you observe something, you can't observe something without influencing it. And when you get down into such a detailed level of monitoring, which we can now do in the sort of world of big data, being able to analyze so many things, we do get to a much closer level where we do influence it. Now, when it comes to managing climate risks, if we're observing and monitoring climate vulnerability, and in the process we are actually reducing vulnerability, our influence on that system by observing it is actually reducing vulnerability, then that's a good thing, that's a win-win. But we have to worry about when those times when we're observing the system, we're actually creating more vulnerabilities or reducing adaptive capacity. So what I'm getting at here is human agency. You can monitor a system and take away human agency, take away control of humans' lives. This came up earlier in one session I was in earlier today, where when people, research shows that when communities have control over their lives, have control over their communities, they are more resilient. They're more resilient to stresses. So what I'd love to see in the context of where gain index leads and vulnerability and capacity indicators more generally is, can we begin to build the systems that use the power of the big data world, but in a way that empowers human agency and allows us to own the data and own the information and help be creators of the information in a way that not only monitors and tracks vulnerability and adaptive capacity, but also builds adaptive capacity and reduces resilience.
Thank you, Amy. And I'll turn it over to Cynthia, who's the CEO and co-founder of CSR Hub and partner and co-founder of EKOS International. She's been an early participant in the sustainability movement to help corporations understand sustainability. And her works involved complex company measurement, reporting, and transparency in sustainability practices. And she's also been involved in evaluating and rating the performance of companies from publicly traded to privately held in the environment. And she has a few slides to share with us today.
Thank you. Thanks so much, and I am delighted and honored to participate in this conversation, and it's wonderful to link big data to our hope for change, especially in this season of hope and expectancy. With EKOS International, I've been really in this sustainability movement for nearly 20 years, helping large corporations integrate sustainability into their core business strategies and operation. And working with companies like Boeing, BNSF, Coca-Cola, and others, we did quite a bit of internal work to benchmark, and always kind of struggled, had developed a somewhat proprietary system to do that as a consultant, but struggled to look for sources and data and really understand how do you help companies understand how they're doing relative to their competitors, their peers, and best in class. I then, about 6 years ago, co-founded CSR Hub and began to work on grapple with this issue of how to rate corporate social responsibility and sustainability of companies worldwide. And if we could get this information, how would it influence us? Today, we're actually a big data platform, and we're an aggregator of sources. And with nearly 40 million data elements, we're now a very comprehensive tool to do benchmarking. I'm now a little bit worried, though, that a number does not tell 1,000 words, but we'll get into it a little bit. We are we're covering 8,400 companies in 104 countries, and we're doing this to hopefully improve performance. I mean, that is really the goal, is to shine a bright light on corporate performance and to really make more transparent the data that is out there. Really, here is a snapshot comparing Coca-Cola to Pepsi. At first, I thought maybe this wasn't a very appropriate comparison. They're really struggling with, I think, issues of now in the perception of obesity and other, I think, nutrition issues. But obviously, they have a footprint issue, and water being their most important footprint challenge. And there's a lot of data on these two companies for 120 sources that we have uncovered that cover their environment, social, and governance performance. However, there are gaps in the data as well. Only 49 of those sources rate both companies. And there's complexity because at least 70 of the major beverage companies are scattered across 27 countries. So, there's just a huge challenge of both collecting the data and then making sense of it. Today, CSR Hub rates 12 indicators of employee, environment, community, and governance performance, and we also flag many special issues, such as it took us several months to just identify what companies are involved in fracking, what companies are doing business in Burma, what companies are in nuclear, or what companies have good, high number of women on the board, et cetera. And so what we have created now is a way to analyze and compare using 290 sources, 10 of which we license from primarily investor-facing analysts. These are known as ESG sources, but we also look at indexes, publications, best and worst of lists, NGO, crowdsources, and government agencies. These ratings are updated monthly, and we are continually ingesting new sources, including crowd-based sources, and hope to eventually rate hundreds of thousands of companies worldwide. So one of the questions that we had was, what is the correlation between a company's performance and its headquartered, where it's headquartered? And in an initial review of this relationship, we correlated our average overall score of companies in our database with the 104 countries that we cover in the GAIN index. We found a 15% correlation. That's not thrilling, but on the other hand, I think the analysis is very preliminary, and I think it's also potentially misleading. If you think about in our system, first of all, it's dangerous because the overall score is really a composite of the 4 dimensions, which are not highly correlated within a company often. So a company might be leading in their environmental activities and lagging in how they treat their employees, or in human rights and supply chain, or product. I mean, so it's very difficult to give an overall number of how a company is actually performing, although we do give an overall number. So then I think there is that issue. There's also the issue that you're averaging a great number of companies within a country. And so, for example, in the United States, we cover 2,500 companies, but in China, we only have 134 companies. Mostly because of the lack of data. Well, the data is probably out there. It's just tough to get. And then I think furthermore, there's the challenge of expanding the boundary of analysis because, of course, much of what's happening in this whole movement of big data is to really understand what's happening beyond scope 1 and 2, and it's moving out into looking at the supply chain performance and collecting that data, most of which is really private and difficult to get your hands on. So this kind of correlation work is exciting. I think it's interesting, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. I think we can also use data as pressure when we're looking at corporate performance. Recently, there was an article by Suzanne Goldenberg in The Guardian talking about 90 companies causing 2/3 of man-made global warming. But I think we can go deeper, and we can say, as we shine a brighter light on these companies, how are they performing relative to one another? For example, I flew here on Alaska Air, and Brad Tilden, their CEO, was sitting across the aisle from me, in coach, I might add, and he said he always flies coach, and they score very high in the CSR Hub rating system. I think they're actually our highest scoring airline, and they've made significant progress in investing in an efficient fleet, and improving their navigation technology and doing many other things. Key factors in reducing their carbon emissions by 30% since 2004. So I think some of the challenges that we have in big data is just that it's gated often by voluntary reporting to important institutions. Now, there's the analysts who are rating companies regardless of whether they want to be rated. They're going out and they're covering them, and they're using data that the company has put into the made public through their CSR report and in other ways. But then there's also a voluntary participation in things like the Global Reporting Initiative, the UN Global Compact, and CDP, which was Carbon Disclosure Project. And here we can see in this chart that the U.S. significantly lags other developed countries, which is obviously disturbing. And this doesn't even compare to the developing world. We know that data disclosure can propel change. CDP has been pushing the boundary and pressuring for many years now because of the investor community. In 2012, 722 institutional investors controlling $71 trillion in assets continued to put pressure on companies to report, and now 81% of the Global 500 and 4,000 companies worldwide are formally disclosing. And this most recent survey included a question on whether or not the company sets an internal carbon price and what it was. And so many said yes and didn't disclose, but I guess 30 plus companies said that they do have an internal price, including, this was startling, many energy companies, and that they're using it for planning purposes. And the quote was, "These forward-thinking companies are preparing for the eventuality that someday in the future they will face a federal, state, or community tax or regulation meant to help combat climate change." What was interesting also is the variation in price. Whoops, I am so sorry. I've been talking away and I forgot to change the slide. So from $6 to $60. I think that in this last slide, just some implications of the work that we've been doing. Yes, there is a link between corporate sustainability, broadly defined, and country climate change adaptation. We have a lot more work to do to understand the relationship. Sustainability improvement is driven by data transparency, and corporate investment in CSR may reduce country-level vulnerability to climate change. I think CSR is a leading driver of involvement and has a strong relationship. There is a strong relationship, I think, in companies that had a strong commitment to sustainability and social equity, and are now also supporting adaptation activities. So,
Thank you, Cynthia.
yeah.
On to Rayid, who I've known for over 10 years now. So Rayid is at the University of Chicago, where he leads a data science fellowship program as well, which is pretty unique from the perspective of how data science can be used for social good. He's also co-founder of EdgeFlip, which is focused on data science problems for social good. And prior to that, he was the chief scientist for Obama campaign. And prior to that, he was with Accenture, managing the data analytics. So Rayid, please.
Thanks. So I think what I thought I could do is sort of
touch on the couple things that both of you mentioned, and from my perspective. So I know nothing about sustainability. I am a computer scientist, so I'm basically looking for interesting problems to solve where I can make some impact. So I've got a bunch of tools and I've got these skills and I want to use them. And the challenge I personally struggle with is there are a lot of other people like me out there who have interesting skills that happen to be in high demand right now, where everybody's talking about big data, whatever that means. If you use that word, you probably don't know what it means, but that's okay. We'll use that, right? So it's a marketing term, and there's a lot of other people who are out there, and they don't quite know how to use those skills to solve the kinds of problems you've been talking about all day, because one, they're not here, and nobody here goes over there to tell them what the interesting problems are. So over here, people will talk about, well, we have all the data and we have no actionable information. Okay, well, have you ever talked to somebody who can help you create actionable information? Probably not. And so the summer program so I kind of got frustrated with this world of, there are people with interesting problems that have large social impact, and then people with skills, and there's nothing combining the two. So people like me, what do? They go to Facebook, they go to Google, LinkedIn, Twitter, Foursquare, pick your favorite internet company or finance company, hedge funds. And that's where people like me go. So if you go to conferences in computer science or anything to do with data, you'll see, more than pretty much most of the talks outside academia are from one of these companies. So students hear about these problems, they get excited by, search problems, so they can rank the search result number 6 to number 4, and that's saving everybody in the world about 2 milliseconds, and that's a huge impact in their minds. And number of seconds saved, if that was your metric, yeah, that's a pretty good metric to look at, and you could maximize, if you saved all that, think how much the world would be more productive if everybody saved 2 milliseconds every time they did a search. Except, who cares? And that's the kind of, so I decided it was time that at least somebody started making some efforts. I saw a lot of people trying to do that. And so I see the small thing I tried to do was this summer I created a summer program called Data Science for Social Good. And I got about 40 students over to the University of Chicago from around the country, computer scientists, stats people, econometrics, public policy, kind of building this group and had them over to come to Chicago. And then we spent a lot of time before the program started talking and working with nonprofits and government organizations, federal, state, local, NGOs, to create data science projects, basically data-intensive projects that had something to do with some social impact, so areas in education and health and energy and community development and disaster relief. And the goal was primarily, one, to get these students excited about these problems, because they'd never heard about these problems. And my sort of impression was, when I first was talking to students about, your skills are really useful for solving all these kinds of problems, I expected the answer to be, yeah, there's no money in there, it's not sexy, it's really boring. The response instead was, didn't realize that these problems, one, had data associated with them, two, that they could actually make a difference, because in their minds, because everything they'd heard about was, again, Facebook, Google, and all these companies, that's kind of all they thought they could really make an impact on. So we spent the summer working on about 10 to 15 projects with these different organizations, and we got this 12-week project, so you can only get so much done on these things. But what was interesting was that it really opened up the scope for seeing how can you really systematically look at these problems and build both capacity in terms of people who in the future who will be working on these projects, but also tools that are required to solve these problems. So when somebody from the education world comes and says, you know what, we're struggling with this problem called undermatching, most of the people outside the education world will look at them and, what are you talking about? And once they describe the problem, it seems it makes sense. So undermatching is this problem of a lot of students today, and this is a huge problem in the U.S., they do really well in high schools. They're really smart. They score really well in all the things you can imagine, all the SATs and ACTs, even in the 99 percentile and plus, and they don't apply to college. And they don't not apply to college because they're going to take a year off and backpack around Europe. They don't not apply to college because they don't know what colleges to apply to, or they don't know anybody else in their network who's applied to colleges or gone to college. Maybe they'll or they apply to a college that's a local community college with a 12% graduation rate. And so one of the things, we work with, this is one project, right? We work with over summers. We work with a school district in Arizona on exactly this problem of identifying which students are at most risk of this behavior, and then designing interventions that you could work with the counselors, the parents, the peers, communities to try to change that behaviors. Now that's basically, so what that opens up to is a class of problems that you can imagine, hey, everybody has a certain number of things they're at risk for, whether that's applying to college, not applying to college, whether it's childhood obesity, whether it's asthma problems, whether it's it's a lot of them are at the individual level, right? So can you start predicting risk of individuals to take certain actions that are bad for them? And that's something that the computer science and sort of the data science community is really good at. We've spent years perfecting predicting people's behaviors. We know really well how to do that. What we lack is the second piece, which is sort of what you were talking about, is we have no idea how to change their behavior. We can tell you exactly what this person's going to do. So when it's the Obama campaign, we could tell you for every person who they're going to vote for, if they're going to vote, are they persuadable? If we were just taking a computer science perspective, we would have just stopped there. Like say, we would have predicted the result and just waited there until the result happened. And that would have been fine because that's what the pollsters do, right? So we predict the result, they predict the result, and they sit there. What we needed to do was, how do we design interventions that change that behavior and move something? Because otherwise, you're just an observer who's predicting really well, can't do anything about it. And that's what, in a way, social scientists are really good at, is taking 20 people and trying to figure out, how do I change their behavior? But there's not much data involved there. It's sort of completely ignoring what I know about them, how I can look at all this data about them. It's just, these are the people, I want to change this behavior. So I think this opens, at least in a lot of social impact space, what it opens up to sort of this collaboration between computer scientists who are really, really good at taking large amounts of data and making very accurate predictions, and social scientists who are really good at taking small number of people and trying to figure out how to manipulate them and how to make them take some action that they would really like to take, but can't scale that to 1 million people. Because for the challenges we're talking about, you really need to scale it to millions and millions of people. And it can't be a human scaling it to, it can't be a one-to-one human contact. It has to be, one person needs to be able to design something that is applicable to ideally, millions, if not more. So those are the kinds of problems we're sort of tackling. The summer is one example of that. We're continuing to sort of work with some organizations, mostly healthcare and education organizations, to come up with these types of projects where we can work with them collaboratively through the University of Chicago and see if we can both start predicting risk of behavior and then also starting to design interventions that can change things at scale. Same kind of work, sort of the work I'm doing at my startup is similar, except it's more looking at sort of how do you do that in the social media world, of how do you influence people. Again, that's something came out of a lot of work we did in the Obama campaign of how do you use social media, which is really not useful for many things, to try to influence people. And it wasn't social media influencing people. It was people influencing people. But it gives you a really good platform because people are connected in some way. Who are the right people and who can influence whom? And how do you build sort of these networks and grow them that can use the data behind them to do the influencing? So that's kind of overview of kind of things I'm working on. Now, the flip side I want to sort of make sure is people who are not in the data world, often they think of data as the all-powerful tool where you can solve all problems. And I think if, you should be very cautious before using data. It doesn't matter if it's large data or small data. Data has a lot of limitations, and I wouldn't suggest, going out and relying on data without doing your homework, right? So for example, I work a lot with the city of Chicago, and many cities have this 311 system, right? Which it's not the non-emergency phone inquiries. So people will complain about potholes and graffiti and broken windows and all sorts of problems. Now, what the city tries to do in general is that's a sensor for them, right? So they get sent data by the city, and their goal is to reduce problems. Now, the way they measure problems is these incoming phone calls. So if they didn't get any phone calls, they've solved the problem, right? So you sort of tell them, well, shut down the phone number, and now you've solved all the problems. But what they end up doing, and there was a study, I think came out a few months ago, based partially on Sandy and other things, that that there's all this data, but it's very biased data. So where do you get pothole problems where calls from, where you don't have bigger issues to worry about? And so if you start focusing on those things and you say that's the truth, you're going to fix the problems that don't really matter, or matter less than the real problems that are happening that are not being reported. So just because there's lots of data doesn't mean that it's accurate, it gives you a right picture of the world, and that you should start basing all your decisions on whatever data you have. You still have to be smart, and you can't sort of now be completely stupid because you have data. And I mean that happens a lot, where you sort of rely so much on data that you won't take any actions unless there's data behind it, and I think that's dangerous. So you have to kind of believe that, I like the hype because it makes people slightly more rational. At the same time, the hype makes them also too dependent without thinking about it. So that's kind of what I'll leave you with is, data is good, but be careful.
Thank you. So before I turn over to the audience for questions, I sort of want to pick up on the theme of, data is useful, data is good, but use it carefully. But now we talked about Google, Facebook, Twitter, the social media companies, etc., wherein they have access to the volumes and volumes of data. Every second, somebody or the other is searching and leaving traces behind, etc. So there is some notion of good quality data coming into these corporations. Now, when we think about countries, when we think about, from sustainability, from adaptation, from all these data fields that go in, whether it's infrastructure question, whether it's agriculture question, whether it's health question, and you could get the answers on potholes by talking to the person over there. But here you may not be able to talk to a person in another country and get what the truth is. How can we create an open data movement, which means that a product which is created can be freely used, distributed, and shared by people, and have more reliable data source coming in, which affect decision making at various levels, and such that we can now say that the data is trending and it won't be real time, but it's more current, it's more complete from that perspective. What challenges we foresee at the global scale? You said U.S. as a developed country is lagging behind, but what challenges do we see at a global scale then? How do we start to get that? Any thoughts?
Well, I'll say a few things. So I think that one challenge is, so you said at a global scale, so that there's a different problem that you're going to say what's a global problem, and what's a problem that is a local problem driven by a global cause, or a local problem in aggregate that's represented in lots of different places.
Absolutely.
So I think that the issue that I was trying to get at, and I think gets to this point, is that one of the challenges of having an open data, one of the opportunities of having an open data movement that enables us to actually solve solutions and not be blind to those people who don't have a cell phone and are reporting that pothole, is to actually create community-based information data collection systems. And so that can't solve all problems. I'm not suggesting that. But if you can have systems where it's community-based development, then they're going to say what's the problem that's most important. And they're not going to say that the potholes have made them vulnerable, so there's some aggregate map that says this is the most vulnerable region because they have potholes. But rather they're going to say what is the thing that they need to be collect data about and what is their vulnerability. Now, I realize that's easier said than done, but I think that we are at a stage where we can help shape the direction of various different technology, data science, and so forth, and indicators to go in one direction versus the other. And the one other thing that I wanted to say about what you said is, I think that it is true that there is big data generally is most often associated with the sort of social media tracking of the hyper here, the hyper local, the hyper here, the hyper now. But in the world of climate change, which I work in, big data is about big climate information, long-term data sets, and when we're thinking about sustainability and vulnerability issues, we really need to think about beyond the here and now. And so when I think about big data, I think about it in the context of really integrating those long-term data sets and with the hyper-local here and now that helps think about the vulnerability. And it's the intersection of those that is still yet to be done in an effective way, but I think has an opportunity to transform how we think about indicators of vulnerability and sensitivity and adaptive capacity and resilience, which I think is an exciting moment, but challenging.
Mm-hmm. I think there are, to increase the flow of information and access to it, so much of the interesting data that I think could be very helpful comes from employees. And so many times employees within a company, and I'm looking at this from a company-centric point of view, but many times employees have a great deal of knowledge about a company's policies, practices, and how they're actually behaving and what the leadership is like. And those, sometimes those will be revealed externally through a CSR report where a company might report on some of the engagement factors, and you might be able to access some of that data. But it's generally speaking, it's kind of tough. I think there is a wealth of information that is there. I just actually did a guest lecture at the University of Washington's iSchool, and it sounds kind of similar to some, and it was really interesting. And we had a student from Amazon, and I said, I really hate to say this, but Amazon, I shop there a lot, so I guess my data hasn't influenced my behavior yet, but they score really low, and on a whole bunch of dimensions, and it's really distressing to me. And this student said, I work for the company, and internally we have as employees, we've been trying to apply some pressure, and we care a lot about these issues, and we want to do more, and we know the weakness. We have a really strong understanding internally of where we're doing well and where we're not. I thought that was interesting, and so we looked to things like Glassdoor or some of these more crowd-based sources for information. We looked to consumers more broadly and their understanding of products and their experience and their perception, but it's difficult to sometimes get that expert understanding as a sort of an outsider. So those are some of the things, and as I mentioned, in terms of supply chain analysis, and really there are, through social media and other platforms, supply chain issues have become more apparent, and I think there's, Apple and its supply chain issues were, I think a good case in point. But there is a huge amount of data that we have yet to, in a sense, put out there and make public that is being collected by folks like Walmart or Home Depot or, Costco, fill in the blank. And that will help us to better understand what is not just happening within the company, but across, around the world in their 100,000 companies. And of course, sharing that, making those, creating ways for companies to share that data is really compelling and important, because often those suppliers are, serving, many masters. So, so those are just two examples, I think, of important data that is not yet easy to get at, but is very rich and important to making progress, I think, along these issues.
I think if you think about sort of open data, and if you're looking at sort of very grassroots open data, you're sort of struggling with three problems, right? One is incentives. Why would somebody do it? And if the incentives are uneven across people, then you're going to get more data from people who have more of an incentive. They hated something, they want a refund, they'll talk about it. That causes problems down the road if you're making decisions based on that data, because you're going to overweight these people unless you know how to deal with that. So I think incentives is a huge problem. Making it available, making it open is fine, but you need to make sure you have some incentive. Two is mechanism. How are you making it easy for people to give you data? Because if it has to be conscious, explicit data collection, that doesn't really happen. You almost want to kind of do a one-time authorization approval, where from now onwards, every transaction that you do kind of goes through the system, and you have to kind of build the trust in the beginning. This is it's not, out in the wild. It's a trusted organization doing it. And it has to be a one-time thing. It can't be a repeated every time you purchase something, scan your receipt. People do that for lots of things, where it's not scalable, right? And the third thing is, which is, again, be careful with data, right? So when you collect all this data, if you just if you just use it naively, it will just give you the wrong information. It will make you take wrong action. So open data, a lot of government, U.S. and U.K. are sort of the big ones, and then different cities, New York and Chicago have been really active in open data platforms, where they're putting out a ton of data about internal functions. The problem is that they've all kind of focused on the data and not on the use of the data. They're all putting out data, and nobody understands that data. Nobody understands what problems these countries and cities face that you can use this data to help solve. And so what people do is, somebody has a weekend free, they go and put it on a map. So you'll see 1 billion hackathons and apps that are this data combined with Google Maps mashup. And it's useful for not many purposes. You can't really do much with a map. You can look at it. It looks nice, like good colors. And I think so the problem is that these organizations aren't going to the people who care about helping them and telling them, here are the 5 problems we're struggling with. Can you help us solve those problems? So I think there is an open data effort, but I think in addition to that, there needs to be some sort of an effort which makes people aware of, here are the problems we face. Can you help solve these problems, as opposed to visualize more data because it's out there?
Can I just respond to that?
Yes, sure.
So, yeah, I think that the problems with big data are the same problems we just have with science, right? There's this meme out there that theory is dead. It's not. The reality is, you have to ask a question of the data, and whether it's big data or the generic indicator, the idea of, here's an index, let's put it on a people, let's put it on a sector, let's put it on, and assume that characterizes that, isn't as effective as saying, what is it about that system that makes it vulnerable, that makes it dead? And from my perspective, but I'm not a data scientist, but I've worked very closely with many of them, what I see as slightly different is, yes, data science is not necessarily, it's finding pattern in data rather than asking questions and seeking the data, so there's a difference. But it is saying, what is it that we can say about a population to characterize the population, rather than what can we characterize and then what does it say about that population? In other words, it is that flip, maybe that wasn't very clear, but it is that flip, which is what I think we need to do with indicators of vulnerability and adaptation.
Yeah, that's the problem. I think one of the things I'm fairly skeptical of many indicators is, how do you know it's correct?
Yeah. Exactly.
just made it up.
Yeah.
You asserted that this is it, and
Yeah, exactly.
if you sort of made it so that it's correct because it predicts this X number of years from now, or when people take action X in 2 years, it will change this by 10%. I think the indicator has to be, you have to add that extra piece to sort of say, well, it will be correct if this happens, because otherwise you just, how do you know?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
one of the points which was made in the panels earlier as well was indicators and tying it with the flexibility of wargaming or scenario analysis.
Right.
That's what it's about, is creating projections or creating for what if this happens. We can't predict when a war would happen, but what if it happens? What would that mean? What if this disaster scenario happens? So really creating that interaction with the data is a lot of where a lot of answers are, because it's question and answer. What's my big question today may not be tomorrow. Something may happen today that would.
Right, and then it's not a yearly thing, right? You don't release a version every year. You have a living tool that people play around with and see, if I do this, it's going to go up by this much. If I do that, it's going to go down. And how do you use
And
that?
then it becomes not just a monitor, but also
It's a
a
decision.
tool
For
for
decision
building collecting the data and using the data becomes a tool for building capacity.
Exactly.
And that's, I think, the
And then there's a
value
feedback
of-
loop that goes back.